The battlefield did not end when the guns fell silent. For Abraham Lincoln, it followed him home. Every morning in Washington began the same way. Stacks of telegrams, reports from generals, lists of the missing, the wounded, the dead. Ink on paper, columns of numbers, cold summaries of unimaginable loss. But Lincoln understood something most leaders never truly face. Numbers can lie. They shrink tragedy into statistics. They hide the human cost behind tidy rows of figures. And sometimes, late at night, long after the clerks had gone home, Lincoln would unfold those papers again. He would trace names with his finger. He would pause at ages, 19, 22, 18, boys who had barely begun their lives. He wondered what their voices sounded like, what their mothers called them, whether they had been afraid. So he did something unusual for a president in wartime. He went to see the war for himself. Not from the safety of a distant command room, not through the confident briefings of generals eager to defend their strategies. Lincoln traveled to the front lines, muddy fields, shattered towns, and makeshift hospitals where the real war lived on long after the shooting stopped. In October of 1862, weeks after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln visited the Army of the Potomac. Antietam had been the bloodiest single day in American history. Over 20,000 men had been killed, wounded, or gone missing in just one terrible day. The battle had ended in a strategic Union victory, but the land still bore the scars. Fences were splintered, trees were shredded by artillery, the ground itself seemed bruised by violence. Lincoln rode through these fields slowly, silently. He wasn't there for ceremony, he wasn't there to give a speech. He came to look. He studied the terrain where men had charged into gunfire. He imagined the noise, the smoke, the confusion. He pictured lines of blue uniforms advancing into walls of lead. He asked quiet questions. He listened. But it was not the battlefield that left the deepest mark on him. It was the hospitals. Inside converted barns, churches, and tents, the wounded lay in rows. Bandaged stumps where arms and legs had once been. Faces pale from blood loss. The smell of infection thick in the air. Surgeons worked without rest, their sleeves stiff with dried blood. Some men stared blankly at the ceiling, shock freezing their expressions. Others groaned softly, drifting between pain and exhaustion. A few clutched letters from home, worn thin from rereading. When Lincoln entered, conversations hushed. Some soldiers struggled to sit up. Others simply stared, unsure if they were truly seeing the president. He did not rush past them. Lincoln moved from cot to cot, shaking hands, speaking softly, asking names, hometowns, regiments. He wrote letters for those too weak to hold a pen. He placed his large, gentle hand on shoulders trembling with pain. Sometimes he said nothing at all. He simply stood there, hat in hand, as if presence itself were a form of apology. Witnesses said his face changed in those rooms. The weight he carried was visible, not just the weight of command, but of responsibility. These men had not chosen the war's strategy. They had not debated politics. They had simply answered a call, and now they lay broken because of decisions made far from the battlefield. Lincoln never forgot that connection. One soldier later wrote that when the president spoke to him, it felt less like meeting a powerful leader and more like being comforted by a grieving father. That was the paradox of Abraham Lincoln. He was commander-in-chief, the man who authorized campaigns, appointed generals, and ordered armies into battle. Yet when he looked at the wounded, he did not see military assets or strategic losses. He saw sons. He saw farmers, clerks, teachers, boys who had barely begun their lives. Boys who now stared at ceilings, wondering how they would return home with half a body and a lifetime of pain. These visits were not politically convenient. They were not staged for newspapers. In fact, many advisors worried they would weaken him emotionally. But Lincoln believed he had no right to lead a war he was unwilling to witness. He needed to see the cost with his own eyes. Because every order he signed sent more men into danger. Every delay, every miscalculation, every failed attack had a human price. If he allowed himself to forget that, he feared he would become the kind of leader history is filled with, powerful, distant, and numb. Lincoln refused to be numb. So he walked among the wounded, and every step made the war heavier on his soul. The visits did not make Abraham Lincoln hesitate to fight. They made him fight with purpose. When he returned to Washington after seeing the wounded, the war was no longer an abstract struggle over territory or politics. It was a ledger written in human suffering. Every decision now carried faces he could not forget. He remembered the soldier who asked if he would ever walk again, the boy who tried to sit straighter when the president approached, the man who whispered, "Tell my mother I was brave." This was the burden of a leader who chose to look. Many in Washington saw the war in terms of strategy. Newspapers debated troop movements like a game of chess. Politicians argued over generals, supplies, and elections. But Lincoln had walked through rooms where men cried out in their sleep, reliving battles that never truly ended. He had held hands that would never again hold a plow, a hammer, or a child. That experience hardened his resolve in an unexpected way. Lincoln began to see that if the Union was to demand such sacrifice, the war had to mean something greater than simply restoring borders. Too many men had bled for the nation to return to the same moral compromises that had allowed slavery to endure. The wounded showed him the cost of delay. Every month the war dragged on without a clear moral purpose meant more hospital tents, more amputations, more letters sent to grieving mothers. Lincoln came to believe that ending slavery was not just a political necessity, it was a moral obligation to the men already suffering. Their pain had to lead to a better nation. This conviction helped shape one of the most consequential decisions of his presidency, the Emancipation Proclamation. When Lincoln announced that enslaved people in rebelling states would be declared free, he reframed the war. It was no longer only a battle to preserve the Union, it became a fight for human freedom. Some criticized him. Some said he was going too far. Others said he had waited too long. But Lincoln carried with him the memory of hospital wards filled with broken bodies. He knew that if men were going to lose limbs and lives, the cause had to be worthy of their sacrifice. His battlefield visits also changed how soldiers saw him. Stories spread of the tall, sorrowful president who walked quietly among the wounded, who listened more than he spoke, who looked as if he personally felt each man's pain. To troops weary of distant commanders and political speeches, Lincoln's presence felt different. He was not a symbol of power, he was a symbol of shared burden. One officer wrote that Lincoln's face seemed cut with care, as though sorrow had carved deep lines into it. Soldiers recognized that expression. They saw it in each other. It was the face of someone who had seen too much suffering and could never be the same. This connection between leader and soldier became one of Lincoln's greatest strengths. He did not lead through fear or grandeur. He led through empathy. He understood that leadership in war is not only about winning battles, it is about carrying the weight of those who fight them. But that weight came at a cost. Friends noticed that Lincoln aged rapidly during the war. His shoulders stooped, his eyes often seemed distant, as though part of him remained in those hospital tents. He slept little, he read casualty lists late into the night. Some evenings he would sit in silence long after meetings ended, staring at the fire, lost in thought. Those close to him understood. He was not thinking about politics. He was remembering faces. The war never left him, yet he never turned away from it. Lincoln believed that to lead in a time of national trauma, a president must be willing to feel that trauma. He could not hide behind ceremony or distance himself behind rank. The men in those hospital beds were not statistics. They were the living measure of every decision he made. So he carried them with him, into meetings, into sleepless nights, into the signing of orders that would send others into danger, into the decision that would redefine the nation's purpose. Abraham Lincoln walked among the wounded, and because he did, he never forgot what leadership truly costs.